I'm Dr. Rahi Victory. I am a reproductive endocrinology and infertility specialist, and I still deliver babies. So tonight, instead of doing our usual educational thing, we're actually going to put a little bit of twist on it, and we're going to talk about one of the deliveries from House of the Dragon, the HBO Super Smash series. So the reason we've chosen this is because there is a delivery in the show, which was kind of traumatic for many people watching it, as well as for those who were experiencing it in the show. And I wanted to bring some science to it and some medicine to it and kind of break down what could have happened and what the signs were, and also helping people understand it, because this is kind of off the beaten path, and we wanted to make sure you could get a chance to follow along with us and see what's going on in my head when I'm watching an HBO show. So follow along with us. This is HBO's series House of the Dragon, and it is the last episode in the season. For those of you that watch the show and haven't gotten that far yet, there will be spoilers, so please stop watching now if that's the case for you and you don't want to know what's happened. And for those of you who have had a traumatic past birth experience or are squeamish, probably again not for you, so full disclosure, please be aware of that. So we're going to watch the show now, and right now Rhaenyra is getting some very bad news. She is supposed to be the queen, and she's about to find out that her family is actually coming for her now that her father is dead. Her father's wife, who is the queen and from a different house, is now after her to try and prevent her from actually becoming the queen.
And for your children, you should leave Dragonstone at once.
Okay, so she has this bad news delivered to her, and all of a sudden she feels this sudden pain, and she kind of reaches down. She's hunched over, and you're gonna watch here. She's realizing something is not right. She doesn't feel well. She's checking under her gown, and her hand is covered in fluid and blood.
Baby's coming.
And she realizes now that she's going to be delivering. So, why is this important? Well, labor never just suddenly starts with a painful contraction, usually. It's typically kind of a slow onset process. You don't just jump into rip-roaring labor. And the presence of the blood could be indicative of the fact that maybe something has gone wrong. She had a sudden onset of pain after receiving shocking news or worrisome news. She also then has some bleeding associated with it. In our heads, when we're watching this, we're thinking she's had a placental abruption. So what's a placental abruption? So if this is your placenta and this is the wall of your uterus, normally they're stuck together. But if the placenta lifts away from the wall of the uterus, shock, trauma, injury, high blood pressure, cocaine use, any kind of violent trauma or any kind of accidental damage to your belly, then the placenta can move away. So if an edge lifts off, all that part in between the placenta and the uterus starts to bleed, and you can end up having that blood come out through your cervix, so you would see bleeding as she does. It's also very acutely painful. So when you get a placental abruption, you have the sudden onset of pain. It's sharp, it's very bad, and then you start to bleed as well. The bleeding can be quite significant. Sometimes the placenta lifts in the middle, where the edges of the placenta, and keep in mind this is supposed to be three-dimensional, will stay attached to the wall of the uterus, but the middle part bulges out and blood collects underneath there. That's called a concealed abruption. And with a concealed abruption, you don't actually see the blood because it doesn't have an escape route, but it still has the pain, and it's quite uncomfortable and still very risky. So what happens when there's an abruption? There can be maternal blood, which is seeping out. There can also be fetal blood, which is seeping out. So this can be very dangerous for a baby. In the show, she's not quite due yet either, so they also realize that this baby is potentially coming early. We'll keep watching.
Is far from complete. This should not be happening. It is happening.
So she knows that even though it's early, and as he says, her term is far from complete, meaning she's preterm, she's saying it's happening. She knows that she's going into labor. Obviously, she's feeling the contractions. And they're reminding her she's been through it. This isn't going to be any different. But she's in a lot of pain, obviously. Okay, so these are her kids. They're fighting on the beach, and all of a sudden her cousin shows up and says, hey, your mom needs to see you.
Your lady mother needs to see you.
Not quite sure why the
Both of you.
mother wants to see the kids. Probably not an ideal idea to bring your kids in when you're in the middle of labor. These boys are still quite young. She's swearing, she's in pain, she's huddled. And she's rubbing her hips. A lot of women will get hip pain when they're in labor. Most of them would be rubbing their back or their front because that's where the pain is going to be.
Your grandson King Osiris' cause. Osiris? The Greens have repudiated the succession and claimed divine throne.
To full labor, she's quite uncomfortable, and okay, so at this point she basically feels like the baby is coming. She's starting to get into position. Her husband's threatening to barbecue some people if they don't swear that they'll follow her, and so essentially she's starting to really bleed. You can see a bit of blood staining on the back of her gown. And his words are echoing what's going on with her. She's still seeing some blood. The midwives want to help, but she wants to deliver herself. There's a lot of blood now. So again, this would be suggestive of an abruption. She won't let anyone help her. She wants to try and deliver on her own. She can feel the baby coming. And you can see there that her water breaks. And there's quite a bit of blood in that water. So keep in mind, amniotic fluid is not typically bloody unless there's been an abruption. So if there's an abruption, then there is going to be blood in the sac. And when you break your water, you'll get a lot of bleeding. But if there isn't an abruption, typically it's a big gush of clear fluid, unless you've got a tear in your cervix or a vaginal tear, but you shouldn't have that if the baby still hasn't started coming out yet. So the fact that she breaks her water and there's blood there is suggestive again that she's probably had an abruption here. And now, of course, it's suggesting that the baby is coming. She feels it coming. She's kind of holding herself. And there's the baby's head. She does catch the baby as it comes out. And it kind of flops onto the floor. Now, I don't think dropping your child on a hard floor is a great idea, obviously, so that was kind of a terrible part. The baby is still looking like it's a little bit in the sac, which makes no sense because if you've broken your water, the sac doesn't come out with the baby. So that's kind of very unusual, but it does look like there's some membrane around the baby there, and she's looking at it, and you're going to see in a second that the baby is not moving, unfortunately. Very sad scene. It's kind of, obviously showing that this baby is not alive. Again, there's a lot of blood there, strongly suggestive of a potential abruption. And she realizes this now and is obviously quite distraught. The pains are subsiding. The placenta is probably still in. And you can see there that the cord is around the baby's neck ×1. Obviously, they've got the baby's face turned away. The baby does look a little bit of an abnormal color as well, some of that being from the blood. But the cord around the neck also could have led to it. Now, it doesn't look particularly tight, but we do know the babies that are born with the cord around the neck can, unfortunately, succumb during labor. Her labor was probably a bit too fast for that to have occurred. Usually it's only if it's going on for a long time, but we don't really have a total timeline here, so who knows how long this has been. And realistically, the presence of the cord could have been a problem as the baby was coming out. Now you kind of get a little bit of a glimpse of the baby. We don't exactly know if the baby is normal or not in any other way. She's got it quite hidden and she's holding it up against her. Is it possible that this all came from something else? Well, she did marry her uncle, and this is the child that is the product of her marrying her uncle. That's a problem. There are shared genes there, and the closer you are in genetic relation to the person that you're biologically producing a child with, the higher the chance that you're going to share recessive genes. So if you have a recessive gene and it runs in your family, obviously there's a much higher chance that your partner, who is your uncle, is also going to share the same recessive gene. You have enough recessive genes that can lead to all sorts of problems. Cystic fibrosis, there's a whole myriad of diseases out there, PEX disorders, Zellweger syndrome, SMA, many different conditions that we test for frequently to rule out in our populations that are trying to get pregnant, that they obviously would have been at a much higher risk for. So maybe this had nothing to do with the abruption and nothing to do with the cord around the neck. This could be a genetic problem because she's having sex with her uncle. I think most of us would agree that's not a good idea. So she's obviously quite distraught. She doesn't look quite as pale as one would think if she'd had an abruption. And usually the bleeding continues, so you got to get the uterus to contract down. Her husband sees her now, her husband, uncle, and she understands now that the baby is fully gone. You can see the head there, it does look a little bit misshapen. It's not quite normal, and again, that was why I started thinking about the genetic link, because there's some indentations that don't quite look normal in the baby's head. You didn't really see them earlier, but they are there now. And now, of course, this is devastating. She's bundling the baby because the baby did not make it. I gotta say, she's a total warrior for just powering through this. I think this would be devastating for any woman, and my sincere condolences to any of you that have ever gone through this before. It's really kind of heartbreaking, but she bundles up the child because she's aware that this obviously is not going forward. And her husband is distraught as well because he knows that this child is not going to be who he wanted it to be, because he really thought this child would someday be king. The rest of it is basically the cremation of the child, and they all give homage to her, not because she's lost her child, but because they recognize her as the queen, and because she's demonstrating so much strength in how she deals with this. Most people wouldn't be able to demonstrate that much strength, nor should you be expected to. A loss of a child in that manner would be devastating for anybody, and to even survive that is pretty amazing, let alone to be able to deal with all your other maternal and or monarchy related duties. So obviously very distressing for people that have gone through this, but wanted to put a bit of a spin on this show because everybody watches it and misses some of these medical details, and I thought maybe this would be interesting for you if you're watching. So that's the obstetrical version of House of the Dragon and the final delivery. There was one more, but we're not going to review that one because it really didn't have a whole lot of value in terms of the brief glimpses. Essentially, the baby is again stuck like it was in the previous video we did, and the mother can't handle it, so she basically asks her dragon to set her on fire so that she and the baby don't have to go through anything worse than what she's already gone through. And so she sacrifices herself and the child in that episode. So I hope you enjoyed the video. It's a great show if you get a chance to watch, and if we see anything else really cool medical, we will bring it to your attention. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again next time.